In the late 1960s, a monster emerged in Scotland that was never caught, in one of Scotland's most important cities, Glasgow, where a music venue called Barrowland epitomized some of the most mysterious and dangerous aspects of the era. This temple of music, with its glamorous glow of neon signs and acoustic design to perfection, hosts a kind of adult event every Thursday and Saturday night, and it's called Palais Night. It was a haven for the anonymous, where the air was thick with the mixture of cigarettes and whiskey, and where married men and women, anesthetized by the combination of alcohol and jazz, unleashed their normally repressed desires as they slipped off their wedding rings and flirted with strangers. However, behind this revelry lurks danger, and there are always shadows peering at the backs of everyone who leaves alone under the dim streetlights. Over a 20-month period from February 1968 to October 1969, 3 brunettes between the ages of 25 and 32 were murdered near the Barrowland. It is well known that there was great prejudice and discrimination against women going to dance halls and bars at that time, and even the original police transcripts even described the victims as highly promiscuous, enjoying male company and flirting with men. The killer was rumored to be called Bible John by the media because the sister of one of the victims said that a suspect who called himself John quoted Bible verses several times while talking to her and her sister. Back in the early morning hours of February 23, 1968, 67-year-old Carpenter was walking down an alley as he headed to work when he saw a man lying on the ground. At first, he thought it was some drunkard who had overindulged last night to the point of falling down drunk in the alley. However, by the time he gently touched his hand to the person lying on the ground, he realized this was not the case, and his sense of touch told him that it was definitely a body that was left behind, as it was like touching a block of ice. For some reason, he thought the remains belonged to a man, so he rushed home and called the police, reporting that he had found the remains of a male. When the police received the report, they were not concerned, considering that it could have been some homeless person who froze to death due to the cold. Even the first person to arrive at the scene was only a traffic policeman who happened to be passing through the area. It wasn't until 8 a.m. that investigators slowly arrived at the scene. But as they turned over the remains that had fallen to the ground, they realized that this wasn't some frozen homeless person at all. For it was the remains of a woman, naked, with only one shoe being worn on her foot, and her body bore the obvious marks of a beating, with severe bruises and strangulation marks on her neck. The initial judgment of investigators was that she had been strangled with a belt, and understanding the gravity of the situation, they immediately cordoned off the area. No female clothing was found at the crime scene, but a sanitary napkin was found near the remains. Then, the medical examiner confirmed that the victim was strangled to death with no obvious signs of sexual assault, and furthermore, that the probability is that she died just a few hours before the discovery of her remains. Police then conducted an extensive door-to-door investigation of the area, and one of the witnesses recalled that she appeared to have heard a woman briefly yell "Let go of me" twice the night before. But she was unable to detect whether or not the woman was in distress because she did not hear any screams or commotion. Another reporter was hosting a party nearby at the time, and despite the large number of guests, no one saw or heard anything out of the ordinary. Discussion of this horrific crime quickly spread throughout the region and eventually reached Victoria Hospital. Some of the nurses wondered if this could possibly be a patient who had walked out of the hospital and died from the cold. So a matron and her assistant went to view the body, but due to severe facial trauma, they were unable to identify it until an ambulance driver saw the body and recognized her as a nurse working at Victoria Hospital. Information about the victim was obtained, and police reported the situation on the news, claiming that the victim was an auxiliary nurse at Victoria Hospital. Later that evening, an old man read the news in the evening paper, and at this time, he and his wife were worried that their daughter had not yet returned home. So he went to the police station with her photograph and eventually identified the deceased as his daughter. The deceased was 25-year-old Patricia Docker, a married mother of a 4-year-old son who was left to live with her child and her parents because her husband, who serves in the Royal Air Force, was on duty in the south of England. Patricia has a hobby. To release stress, she takes one day a week to get all dolled up and go dancing. On the night of February 22nd, she told her parents that she was going to a dance hall. For the elderly couple, they assumed their daughter had gone to a dance hall she used to frequent, so the police focused most of their efforts on the investigation there. However, 3 days after the investigation began, an eyewitness said that he had seen Patricia dancing with several men one of whom had red hair, at the Barrowland Ballroom. And since it was Palais night, and those involved in the dance were somewhat anonymous, the police were unable to locate any credible or detailed eyewitnesses at all, and were only able to obtain a vague and unconfirmed tip. Someone claimed to have seen a white Ford loitering in the neighborhood at midnight, but when the passenger reported it to police, they ruled out the lead. Weeks after the murder, a person from the north of England released an anonymous letter claiming that she was in Glasgow city centre that night and may have known the identity of the killer. And police appealed to the woman to come forward, claiming that the information in the letter was vital, but she never did. 18 months after Patricia's murder, on Saturday, August 16th, 1969, Palais night, the mother of three, Jemima Macdonald, 31 years old, was already a regular at the Barrowland Ballroom, and according to family custom, her sister would take care of the three children in her absence. So on this day, she went as usual to attend Palais night, but she did not return home even Sunday. Her sister was very concerned about Macdonald's safety because she had heard gossip from her neighbors who said that someone had heard that a child had found the remains of a body in an abandoned building. When Monday came, Macdonald's sister was so worried that she was also afraid that the remains were her sister's. So she went into the old building where she found her sister's remains. Macdonald was lying face down with her shoes and stockings discarded nearby, and the autopsy report indicated that the cause of her death was strangulation by her stockings, that she had been severely beaten, especially in the face, before her death, and that her exact time of death was roughly 30 hours before the discovery of her remains, in the early morning hours of August 17th. Investigators immediately surveyed the neighborhood and found several witnesses who claimed that Macdonald was accompanied by a young, well-dressed, articulate, short-haired man who appeared to be slim, would have been between the ages of 25 and 35, and was roughly 6 feet tall, before she and the man left Barrowland in the general direction of her home walking. Later, police learned that after they left the ballroom at about 12:40 a.m., Macdonald and the man were standing in the doorway of the abandoned building where her remains were later found. And that witness noted that when she warned Macdonald to be safe, she just waved her hand unconcernedly. And that door-to-door questioning by the police also uncovered a woman who had additional information that she remembered. On the night Macdonald was murdered, she heard female screams, but she could not remember the exact time, so police did not find this information useful to their investigation. Initially, despite widespread public outcry, the police investigation into Patricia's murder quickly became an open case because they lacked witnesses and corroborating evidence. And investigators didn't even figure out that Patricia had gone to the Barrowland Ballroom the night of the murder until 3 days after the remains were found. Just days after the discovery of Macdonald's remains, the police linked Patricia's and Macdonald's cases. They found several similarities between the two cases. Both women went to the Barrowland Ballroom on the night of the murders. They were both violently beaten before they suffocated to death, and the handbags were taken by the murderer. While these similarities existed, they did not conclusively link the two murders to the same murderer, but neither did they completely reject the theory. In addition, as a result of the two murders, the police sent undercover officers to secretly monitor Barrowland on a daily basis. However, 2 months passed, and not only did investigators fail to find a suspect, but Barrowland's principals blamed the police for causing their business to suffer. So, in late October 1969, the police terminated the covert surveillance. Just days after the police terminated their covert surveillance, on October 31st, 1969, a man walking his dog found the remains of 29-year-old Helen Puttock, stripped naked, beaten about the face, dead from strangulation, with her belongings, which had been in her handbag, strewn about the vicinity of a drainpipe at the back of a block of apartments in Glasgow, and deep bite marks on her wrists, as well as stains on the soles of her feet and shoes, confirmed that she had fought fiercely against her murderer, and there were cuffs from a man near her remains. Upon investigation, on the very night of the murder, Helen and her sister Langford went together to the Barrowland dance hall, where they met two men who both identified themselves as John, Helen's dancing partner being a stonemason living in Castlemilk. But the focus of the case was Langford's dance partner John, who was an articulate man and who did not disclose where he lived. And after the four left the ballroom, Helen's dance partner said goodbye early. He boarded a bus and left, and then Helen and Langford and John hailed a cab. Langford describes John as a tall, slim, well-dressed young man with strangely shaped teeth, two incisors overlapping, He has a Glaswegian accent. He wears well-tailored suits. His hair is reddish in color and neatly combed round at the back. His watch has a wide military-style leather strap, and he wears out-of-place leather boots. And he's between 25 and 30 years old. He was about 6 feet tall. He had blue-gray eyes. Most of the men who frequented Barrowland were rather rude, but John was polite and well-spoken, so Langford was impressed with him, and she remembers John saying his last name, which was probably Templeton, Sempleson, Emerson. However, the reason she thought John was a suspect was because of an incident they had encountered. Langford remembers that when she tried to use the cigarette machine, it jammed and was unable to dispense her purchases. An incident which led to a sudden change in John's otherwise polite demeanor. He demanded to see the manager and got into a heated argument with the staff member, and also shouted out a question as to who the local counselor was, before he turned around, arrogantly saying that my father had told me that the Barrowland Ballroom was a den of sin, and that they used to set the place on fire to get the insurance money and then paid for it with the money they got. Langford then sees John show Helen an ID card, which seems to impress her. However, when Langford asks to see the ID card as well, John turns her down and says, "Do you know what happens to nosy people?" When Helen gets in a cab with Langford and John, he adds that he doesn't approve of married women going to Barrowland, and when the two women tell him that they're married, he responds by quoting the Bible and saying, "Do you know what happens to an adulterous wife? She is stoned to death." John also revealed part of his family situation, saying that he was an only child, but then later retorted that he had an older sister, adding that alcohol was not allowed in his home. And when his sister came home, she was denied entry to the house because she was drunk. And then Langford argued that John appeared to regret mentioning his family because he again tried to change the subject to foster homes and foster children on. As the cab travels down the road, Langford realizes that John's advances are aimed at Helen because John considers her an inconvenience in the car. And he even asks the driver to take Langford home first and then Helen, even though Helen's home is located much further away. And when Langford is dropped off at her home, it is the last time she will ever time she saw Helen alive. Later, police located the cab driver from that night, who provided them with details of the last part of the trip, saying that upon arriving at his destination, the articulate man was unable to pay the fare, even though he said he would pay in advance, and that it was Helen who ended up pulling money out of a red wallet and giving it to him. As the driver of the car was unfamiliar with the road, he went the wrong way while reversing. When he rejoins the road, he sees John clinging to Helen, and then the two get into an argument. But the driver assumes that the two are just lovers arguing, so he takes off, not noticing in the slightest that anything is amiss. With the news carrying the suspect description provided by Langford, a driver, conductor and passenger of a night service bus reported the situation to police as they realized that they had most likely come into close contact with the suspect. That time was about 2 a.m. on October 31st, and a man boarded the bus who appeared to be in a particularly disheveled state, with mud stains on his jacket, bright red marks or scratches on his cheeks, and who repeatedly tucked one shirt sleeve into the sleeve of his jacket, and who paid his fare by pulling the money out of a red wallet, which Helen's red wallet had disappeared from the scene of the crime, and in the end, the man got out of the car at the intersection of two streets. At this point, the suspect was characterized by his two overlapping incisors, reddish hair, roughly 6 feet tall, a local accent, and what appeared to be a military background, as his watch had a wide military-style belt. So within hours of finding Helen's remains, police created composite footage of the suspect using a detailed description provided by Langford, who noted that it was an excellent likeness. Because John's hair was considered short and not quite normal for that era, the investigators' idea of solving the case was to start by questioning all the hairdressers in the area and all the dentists in the area. But despite the fact that they questioned more than 400 of them, the answer the police got was that they had no leads. The police sent more than 100 investigators to conduct door-to-door interviews. However, even after collecting 50,000 statements, interviewing more than 5,000 potential suspects, and having Langford participate in more than 300 identity parades, with all suspects ruled out, there was still no progress in the case. Then the police had to continue to wait and see. They sent 16 investigators disguised as ordinary people into Barrowland, but it was as if John had been given a special message. And from then on, no one else became a new victim. He disappeared completely. That the police investigation into the 3 murders grew progressively colder as time passed, with many of the officers assigned to the case believing that John was either dead, incarcerated for unrelated offenses, confined to a mental institution, or that a senior police officer knew his true identity but could not prove that he had committed the murders. Others have speculated that John may have simply moved away from Glasgow, a possibility that prompted police to circulate multiple copies of the composite sketch at all British Army, Navy and Air Force bases in the UK, Europe, the Middle East, and the Far East, but did not turn up any significant leads. In 2005, investigator Les Brown claimed to have identified a potential suspect who bore a striking resemblance to the composite sketch of John. During questioning, the man provided a false name and address before revealing his real name, John Edgar. Years later, Brown had an extensive conversation with an investigator who had arrested Edgar in connection with a separate incident involving a head injury after an argument, and Edgar fled the hospital shortly after receiving medical attention. Upon seeing Brown's autobiography, Edgar immediately offered a DNA sample to clear his name, which ruled him out as a suspect. Several years after the triple murder, several women claimed that they had been sexually assaulted after spending an evening at the Barrowland Ballroom, and one of them, Hannah Martin, claimed that in April 1969 she had left the ballroom in the company of a tall man, with whom she had then had sex and accepted his offer of a ride home. However, while driving, the man's sexual demeanor became more aggressive. Martin was drunk, and out of fear of a possible attack, she vomited in the car. The man then simply threw her out of the car and drove off alone, leaving her standing on the side of the road, and eventually, Martin gave birth to a girl, who one writer claimed was Bible John's daughter. In 1996, police dug up and took DNA samples from the remains of John Irvine McGinnis, who committed suicide in 1980 while serving in the Glen Guard at the cemetery. He was one of Bible John's original suspects. John Templeton's cousin, related to a senior police officer. Templeton's looks and height were very similar to Bible John's, and his last name was related to a tip Langford had given earlier. However, Langford, the only person who had any contact with John, did not pick Templeton out of countless identity parades, and even as late as 1996, Langford still insisted that Templeton was not the murderer. And furthermore, the lead attorney at the time said there was not enough evidence to link Templeton to the murderer. Peter Britton Togan was a serial killer who some speculate was Bible John, as he lived in Glasgow in the late 1960s, and in August 1969, after marrying his first wife, he moved to England. Because Peter's murder methods and modus operandi were so sophisticated, many believe he killed others before he murdered his first known victims. However, his suspicions were ruled out by the police, because although it was often reported in the press that Peter had moved from Glasgow after the 1969 murders, he had in fact left Glasgow with his wife at the time of Macdonald's murder, and Peter's height did not at all match that of the murderer, who was only 5 feet 6 inches tall, and Langford also insisted that he was not the murderer. To this day, the case remains a mystery, and although it is believed to be a serial murder, the fact is that there is no strong evidence that the 3 murders were committed by the same person, and that there was a gap of 18 months between the first and second murders, and that, in addition, no other victims were found, which is highly unusual and inconsistent with the behavior of a serial killer. Many believe it's highly likely that Bible John was being shielded by government officials or high-ranking police officers, and it's a possibility that perhaps the second murder and the third were copycat killings by the mystery man.